In this video, we're going to be using SAP Business Objects Data Services to connect to a SQL Server database and take some data and store it in SAP HANA. So the first thing we need to do is to log into Data Services. So we do that by going to Start. We can access that from All Programs, Data Services, and we choose the Data Services Designer. Log in with your credentials. So for me it's student and the password is welcome1, and then it logs you into the system. So the way we connect to a database is by building a data store. We do this in our 6th tab called Data Stores, and we can see here we've already got a connection to our HANA database where we're going to be loading all this data. So to create a data store to SQL Server, which you would normally do to a database, you can go to Project, New, and select Data Store. We give our data store a name, so I'm going to call this SQL Server. The data store type is going to be database, and you can see that these are all the different types of data stores that we can create. The database type will be Microsoft SQL Server, although of course we could access that with ODBC as well. We choose the specific version that we've got, so we're actually connecting to a Microsoft SQL Server 2008 system. Of course, alongside SQL Server, we can actually choose just to connect to ODBC if you haven't got the correct drivers on your machine. So obviously you should connect for performance reasons with the correct version of the database, but again we can also connect with ODBC. Of course, to do this you would have had to have created an ODBC data source on your box, which I have done here, called localhost. So this is pointing to my SQL Server database. So then all you need to do is enter your credentials and click Apply. And then click on OK. Just to make sure we can connect to that database, we can expand our SQL Server data store, expand our tables and double click. What we will then be able to see are all the schemas and all the tables available in that user. So for me, I want to import this dim shippers table. If I click on repository metadata, we can see that none of the tables have yet been imported. So again, I'm going to go to external metadata, right click on dim shippers and select import. We can see on the right that it's been imported, and now if I expand my list of tables and right click on dim shippers, I should be able to view the data. So now to get the data into SAP HANA, it's very, very straightforward. So the first thing we need to do is build a project. So if I go to my list of projects, I'm going to create a new one called SQL Server. I'll then create a job called SQL Server. And lastly, I'll create a data flow called SQL Server. So now within the data flow level, we can actually start to do our ETL, or extract, transform, load. We go back to our data store, we select the table that we want, in our case it's dim shippers, and we drag it and put it on our canvas. If I can examine this table, of course, by selecting the magnifying glass, and also I can double click on the table and look at the data within. Now the interesting thing here is that because the data is in SQL Server, we already have a primary key. Because we've got a primary key, what it means is that, of course, SAP HANA, when you build a column store table, you need to have a primary key as well. But because we've already got the primary key, now we can just add a template table on our canvas. I'm going to call this SQL Server, and I'm loading it into the STS schema, and I can click on OK. And again, because we've got the primary key defined in the source table, we don't need to add a query transform. We just need to select the output from the source table and drag it to the input of the HANA table. So if you're simply copying data from a variety of ODBC databases or other databases which I showed you before, if the primary keys have been established and all the indexes, you should be able to simply import the table, drag it to a template table and execute the job. So to do this, I'm going to right click on my SQL Server job, click on execute. I'll be prompted to save all the changes. I'll click on yes, and then I'll click on OK to execute the job. Of course, we're looking at the job completed successfully. We can also see that there are no errors. And if we look at the Monitor tab, we can see that we've actually indeed loaded those 12 rows. Of course, a couple of more checks are to go into SQL Server into the data flow. And now we have a magnifying glass that we can open up so we can see that the data is in HANA. And of course, the last check would be to go into the SAP HANA Studio and look at the schema to make sure that the table actually exists. So if I expand my database and I go into my schema STS, now within my tables folder we have a table called SQL Server, and of course if I open up the data preview I can see that table has been created. Again, the key thing now is if I double click on the table in SAP HANA Studio, we can see the definition of the table and we can see that we have indeed automatically added a primary key. So again, if the primary keys have already been built in the source table within the database, then you don't need a query transform. So that's a very simple demo on how SAP Business Objects Data Services can connect to SQL Server or indeed any other database that connects with ODBC. We can then take that data and copy it into a SAP HANA database.